All right, thank you everyone for coming, and hopefully everyone online can hear us as well. If they're a little bit too quiet, just type it in the chat. So just as mentioned before, so my name is Tony. I am an excellence in teaching and learning leader at Doncaster Secondary College. And what that pretty much means, it's kind of like I'm a learning area leader across every single subject across Year 9, Year 10. Who I also have here with me today is my colleague Cass Scardellis, who is the learning specialist for maths. What we're presenting today is going to be, I guess, a little bit of a journey of what we've been doing at Doncaster Secondary College around applying VTLM 2.0. So it's not just secondary school context. From primary school teachers, you might be able to get a few ideas from here as well. And it's not just purely all mathematics. I think with the start part, the 2.0 and cognitive load theory, that's definitely be a lot more applicable to all. But if you've got any questions about your own specific context afterwards, do feel free to have a chat with us afterwards, or I can also share my email, okay? So just to get us a little bit warmed up, I want you all to have a conversation with people around your table, especially if the groups are really big. Maybe you want to split off into smaller chats. I want you to have a think about what are some of the barriers that stop you from extending your high ability students. So you introduce yourselves from different schools and have a quick chat. We'll do this for maybe like 3 minutes because we do have a lot of slides to get through. All right, off you go.
I'm Bernadette Boxhill. We know each other.
From Elementary College. South locally called.
Sorry, prep to 12.
That's what we've standardised. What are some of the barriers stopping?
I call classes.
Do we face?
Yeah,
I immediately thought of time, in terms of time to plan, time to figure out where to fit things into one of the big teachers.
Oh, okay.
So, yeah.
Like so out there, they read that
Interesting.
but
English classes are part of a team.
what if you end in context? So we have being able to sort of by the middle of the year, they sort of start to peter out. But I still have the expectation of still a bit of a grade. Sort of still be
Probably something similar. The idea of having fairly
Sorry to push for time, but half a minute more, so 30 more seconds.
beyond that.
A lot of issues. Yes.
There's a lot of perceived parameters for each child. You know, there's perceived parameter how each child will be performing at each level, like a 7, 8, year 8.
Because so we had like this.
Yeah, hi, I'm Bryce. I was eavesdropping. I agree with the first point, teaching knowledge more than anything else. I'm not sure.
But I'm making assumptions about students.
Okay.
It was terrible. But what we do
And I think cultural systemic culture as well. So, you know, we're in a
Something 7 seconds.
ultimately it is a lot of the resources. If you want to go to resources, they do go to
Different context is like every school, but for us, it's around the whole idea of fairly superficial and passive learning, laughing students, and how to get them to actually go to that higher order.
money and effort. And I think that
Your observations of
that at the forefront of their minds.
But the kids want that as well.
Thank you, everyone. We'll start wrapping it up.
Yeah, I think the barriers maybe.
Whilst I normally love to get people to share a bit, but I know whenever I bring up a question about problems or issues, that's what's barriers, I know that can overtake the whole session. So we can chat a bit more about this at lunchtime as well, especially. So what I want to talk a little bit about quickly is, first of all, just the journey that we have gone through at Doncaster Secondary College. What I want to preface is that I wouldn't say that we are like major experts in this space. What I just want to share with you is the journey that we've been on. And maybe from hearing our journey, you might notice some of the little mishaps we've had along the way that you can avoid, things to think about in your own context. So with context, so our principal at Doncaster Secondary College, Glenn Morris, he is the network chair of principals across Monash and Manningham network of both primary and secondary schools. And so what he shared with us as a staff is that, hey, I've been directed by the department that this new thing coming in, VTLM 2.0, it's not going anywhere anytime soon. So it's not this fad that's only going to be around for a little bit. It's going to be at least minimum the next 4 years, right? Because that's how long the cycles are. So what we decided to do was, well, let's get started on this journey and let's just make mistakes along the way and let's see what we've learned. So in 2024, how we started with our AI planning was initially we think about, let's maybe focus on personal and social capabilities in 2025. But then as our leadership team started to read a lot more over the break around what the VTLM 2.0 is, we noticed that it was actually very imperative to implement it as soon as possible. And here's a few resources, and I know pages you would have seen downstairs in the book, but these are 2 other websites, one from Aero, one from the Academy, that we started to do a bit of reading about. But what we have found to be the single most useful resource is this book over here. I myself have got young kids at home, so I don't have a lot of time to read. I haven't read in a very long time. But this book I found nice and short, practical, broken into 3 parts. If you want to skip the theory and just go straight to practice, you can do that as well. So I found that this book, a lot of what we talk about today will be based on this and how we've been trying to roll it out to all our staff members at Doncaster Secondary College. Yeah. Now, of course, here today, I don't know if we have like leaders, if we've got regular teachers, principals, assistant principals. So just to give you a little bit of a summary, I've broken up into the 2 sides. What were some of the things our leaders had to focus on? And what were some of the things our teachers had to focus on this year to start implementing the 2.0? Now, my colleague Tascard Ellis, when he comes up, he'll talk a bit more in the context of the high ability students, because that's the classes that he teaches. So I'm going to start more general first at the tier 1 level about how we implement it across the whole school. And some of the conversations I was hearing just then talked a bit about, well, maybe resourcing, or maybe it's the time resourcing. But what we've noticed is that if we actually improve some of these practices at the tier 1 level, it actually flows on quite naturally into those high ability program spaces as well. So have a seat. Yeah, good. Yeah. With people being at different schools, I wanted to first of all have a little fingers up, because this will indicate to me, this is like my little check for understanding per se. I wanted to see how quickly I should fly through the basics of VTLM 2.0 and cognitive load theory, or if I should spend a bit more time on it. And then based on your fingers, that's when I know when to call my colleague up, who can then talk a bit more about the actual application. So 0 being, yep, no confidence, our school's not really doing anything about it. Whereas 10 is like, yep, we've been working in the VTLM 2.0 space, we've been doing PDs about it, we've been implementing it. So from a 0 to 10, could you get like a quick indication of how confident you feel about both things? 6. Like we understand that that's 6 in the Chinese context. Okay, cool. So we're averaging around 6 to 7. So what I'll do is I probably will be at a medium pace, not super fast, but not super slow, a medium pace. But if you were one of the lower numbers, I can see some numbers in the chat as well. If you are one of the lower numbers, definitely feel free to have a chat with myself or my colleague across the day. And like I said, we can share our emails afterwards. So with the VTLM 2.0, there are the 2 components, the elements of teaching and elements of learning. What we do want to focus a bit more on today is actually more the elements of learning. You will see the elements of teaching being embedded in little parts across it. And so this is straight from the department website around what the element of learning is. And as you can see at the very top, it goes hand in hand with cognitive load theory. So cognitive load theory, aspects of it, the foundations are at the start, but a majority of it comes through here. So we'll talk about our journey at Doncaster, how we've been cycling and slowly rolling out this process to our staff members. And then my colleague Tass will then talk about what that looks like on the ground in the classrooms. So just a quick snapshot of what cognitive load theory is, because I'll be using some of this language. So just to go over it again, we understand that there is an infinite environment that you're in right now. There's the wind blowing outside, there's the lights flickering on, people doing a whole bunch of things. And what our job is as a teacher is to try and focus our students into the one part of the environment we want to focus on, which is what we're teaching, right? And then our students would then have to bring that into what we call our working memory. And that's the amount of slots or information students can hold in their brain at a single time before they overload. A lot of what we find in high ability programs is finding that fine balance of, if it's not enough content difficulty, it's too easy, it's too boring, and then we'll somehow sometimes pitch it way too hard and they still overload as well. So it's finding the right sweet spot. And then what they talk about in the science of learning is that learning is actually moving that working memory content into the long-term memory space that can then be pulled down into applications whenever we require them to. Now, one thing that I have been, I guess, reading a lot about is a common misconception with our high ability students. There is this, well, one very common misconception is that just because a high abilities class and student, I can just offload a whole bunch of content onto them and they're just going to take it on just fine, all right? There's been no research to show that in this 4 to 7 slots of working memory, the high ability students always have to have more slots, all right? So what I mean by slots, if you haven't heard those terms before, so think of it as if I'm talking about concepts. Think about how many concepts you teach a student in a class. You teach them the first concept, that's 1 slot. Second, third, fourth, right? High ability students, some of the students get there because of natural talent, and some get there just from hard work. And if you think about those hardworking students who get there because they're just pushing through and studying a lot, that definitely means that they don't have more slots in their memory. So that's something to be aware of. Of course, chunking is a technique that you could use, that you can read a bit more about to help, I guess, compartmentalize some of these concepts into smaller slots. But just because you have high ability students, that doesn't mean that you can just offload a whole bunch of content onto them. So how did we start our year? So as Doncaster Secondary College, we have a PLC process that we go through every single week. And in our PLCs, what we started with was introducing our staff to some of our attitude to school survey data. And we looked at some of these spaces around securing attention, setting the appropriate levels of challenge, or setting the right positive learning environment. From there, we wanted our staff to actually check in on students and how we think that they're going based on observations, student surveys, and also teacher surveys. So this is us actually starting with the very first part, which is attention, focus, and regulation. Now, I know in high ability classes, not always, but usually this part you feel like you can fly through quite easily, right? But I know every context is different. Most contexts, you're like, hey, I'm a high ability class, they're meant to be well behaved. I don't really need to do too much work, set up the environment for them to focus, right? So what we started with, as I mentioned, was we started with the idea of securing the attention of all students. So even our high ability classes, they've lined up, they've sat down. How do we ensure that they're starting themselves in a learning environment straight away, that they're not just chatting to their friends, settling in? How do we get started? And so what we've looked at is these 3 different techniques to try and get our students to get started with the content. And so our PLC groups could choose between one of each of these 3 strategies, and then they went through cycles to see how successful they were, and then what they implemented afterwards, right? Almost like a mini action research per se. And I'm saying that because my uni lecturer is right here, John, and I don't want to fail my course. All right, so in term 1, all of our staff looked at securing attention as their focus. So here's an example of a focus that our staff will work on. If we explicitly teach and monitor habits around the attention of students, we'll improve their attention, which will then also improve the consolidation, and in a maths context, order of operations in a complex question, okay? How we sorted out our PLCs is based on learning areas first, and then year levels a bit as well afterwards. Moving on to term 2, what we then decided to do was, well, there's still aspects of attention, focus, and regulation that is still useful, that some of our staff members are very passionate about. So some of our staff members started to look at transitions or look at how they actively supervise a classroom. And these are some examples of what that could look like. But then other classes also have the ability to then move on to the next component, which is what we found most of our SEAL classes, our high ability classes, really wanted to move on to straight away. So they also had the option to move into the knowledge and memory space. So I'll pause it here for a little bit, especially around activating prior knowledge and chunking and segmenting. In our context at Doncaster, our SEAL classes love to look at the activating of prior knowledge. So for example, in the green, there's one example of what that could look like. And of course, it's very easy to make assumptions in a high ability class, but sometimes we forget that we have new students join in, especially at the year 7 year level, sometimes coming from different primary schools. They all got different foundations. Yes, they all had higher academic outcomes. They might be at 7.0 per se, but what are some of their weaknesses, right? So that activating prior knowledge was still very important for us. So that moved us into term 3. So term 3, what we decided to do was actually slow it down. We actually decided not to move our entire staff into a cycle of retention recall. We allowed our staff to actually consolidate and go back to the first 2, which is once again, as a reminder, the attention, focus, regulation, or they could focus on knowledge and memory. But then our leadership team decided to then PD our staff in our weekly meetings around some of the components of cognitive load theory. So with cognitive load theory, there's a few bits of language that I want to draw upon that might be useful for all of you to think about. So the first part is this idea of intrinsic versus extraneous load. Extraneous load, what it is, it's the things that is distracting your students from the learning. We want to reduce as much extraneous load in the working memory space of our students. And what we want to optimize, now the keyword is optimize, not increase. We want to optimize intrinsic load. And what that means in a high ability class is, how do you ensure that the work or the content that you're teaching them isn't way too low, where the intrinsic load is super low, they're not learning anything, or sometimes we accidentally go way too high. And I'll show you examples of that. And what we find is that you've got to be aware, Monday, period 1, or first class in the morning versus a Friday, period 5, the same group of students, obviously, the intrinsic load that you offload onto them can be quite different, right? So that's why we use the word optimize. Sometimes it is increase, but sometimes it's also decreasing the content that you are offloading onto them. So it's the amount of content and it's also the difficulty of the content as well, all right? This is an example from the book that Ollie Lovell had, where he talks about, for example, in the white space on the very far left, if that is the maximum amount that our students can hold in their working memory at one moment, you'll see that cognitive overload looks like if you're giving them way too much work and way too high difficulty, and you're forgetting about all the other factors that's contributing to them not being able to focus. Like I mentioned about the end of the day, really hot in a room, noise levels, right? So what you want to do is sometimes you might want to reduce the intrinsic load. And how do you do that? That's where your checks for understanding come in. And that's when my colleague Cass will come in and talk a bit more about what the classroom structure looks like to have those formative assessment checkpoints to adjust the intrinsic load along the way. Sometimes what we do accidentally as well is that we accidentally set our work a little bit too low in terms of amount and difficulty. And there's actually a little bit more space left for our students to actually take on a bit more information to be challenged. So what you want to do sometimes is actually increase the intrinsic load on the students, and that's what we call the most efficient instructions. One of the last parts I want to talk about before I start moving on to the examples in the classroom is this idea of something called element interactivity. So element interactivity, it's adjusting the number of steps required to solve a problem, or the amount of interacting parts when you're teaching content. So for example, low interactivity content could look like, hey students, let's find where Melbourne is on this map. You can teach it in isolation. Higher interactivity has multiple components. All right, point out where Melbourne is on the map. Now I want you to look at latitude, longitude, tell me the coordinates, and there's extra components, right? So as you can see, these are the things that you could adjust to adjust the intrinsic load. And my last part I want to talk about is that last term 4 slot, mastery and application. So the last part of the VTLM 2.0 and the elements of learning is this idea between, well, what does explicit instruction look like for our novices? And also, what does explicit instruction look like for our experts? And that's where usually our high ability students are. I'm going to use a chess example. So for novices, what they require is a lot of worked examples to develop thinking skills in the domain of chess. I have a brother-in-law that's a lot younger than me, and I still remember trying to teach him chess. It was like, hey, this is the horse, you move it like this. This is the bishop, you move it like that, right? So it's very guided worked examples, instructions one by one, and that's what we do with our novices. With our experts, if there was one of my kids at year 9 who is already well-versed in chess, you wouldn't be doing that. You'd be getting them to problem solve a lot more, and you need to actually explicitly teach problem solving. What does that look like in a chess context? Hey, in the 1948 game of the finals, this was the situation that the 2 grandmasters were placed in. How would you solve this scenario? How would you get out of this scenario, right? So it's very interesting because in the book, it mentions that a lot of people tend to think that problem solving can be explicitly taught, and some people think that it also can't be explicitly taught, but it really comes down to the context. So if you talk about domain specific, so in your subjects, you can actually explicitly teach them examples of problem solving. So that's the example that I'm going to talk about over here. Without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Tass, who will talk a bit more about what that looks like in a classroom context.
Thank you, Tony. So yes, my name is Tass. I teach maths, science. I've got a science extension class this year. I've got a maths extension class in year 9, and I teach physics as well. I'm going to pick up from where Tony left off, talking about our PLC process in our year 7 maths PLC group. We began our inquiry stage by looking at the data. So we looked at where students are in terms of PAT, where they were feeling in terms of ATOS. We also had their previous NAPLAN data, which was a bit older, so we went mainly with the PAT, which we did at the beginning of the year, and also looking at what our experiences were with them at the beginning of that year too. So it helped us set our focus. And in our first cycle, which was in term 1, we actually tried to just get them to walk into the classroom and sit down within 30 seconds and to actually start the first activity. And to the point where we had like countdown clocks and created a bit of anxiety around it too, like go, go, go. But it was really effective because now they just line up, they just walk in and they know they've got 30 seconds to pick up the pen and start writing the first word or idea. And it's just the simplest thing we could do from the very beginning to set that habit, hopefully that they'll continue through with. So we then decided to move on to activating prior knowledge, that second one there. And we thought about how we could do this. We have our do now activities at the beginning of the class, which tend to be a bit of a fix all for every time we have an issue or trying to fix something. It's like, it's stood in the do now. But this is the ideal point to really capture where they're at and to remind them of what they need. We went into the research. We provided a lot from our leadership. We went and did a bit of our own research too. We sat with that for the first couple of weeks. And as Tony talked about, looked at working memory, long-term memory, and how we're going to really optimize this process. So it's the most effective teaching. And then we also looked at a lot of the department resources. There's a lot of great stuff out there in the department. They've even got a whole info slide thinking about this, which we also read through carefully. And also looked at the principles of instruction as well, talking about how daily reviews help us strengthen the previous learning. To look at beginning a lesson with a short review of the previous learning and how most effective teachers ensure teachers effectively acquired, rehearsed, and connected the knowledge. So how can we do that in maths? To take a step back, in the broader context at our school, we've actually been doing a lot of work in what's called building this curriculum map to change the way we do assessment. So we started with the scope and sequence you can find on the Victorian Curriculum 2.0 website. Download that, gives it as kind of a progression, but not really, but at least a starting point, looking at the achievement standards, the content strands, etc. And then looking at how we could build our own map of skill continuums across level 5 all the way to 10A or 10 plus. We then were able to create developmental rubrics for each section in each strand, and then focus on individual skill continuums. Why am I bringing all this up? Because I felt this was really important for helping the students identify exactly where they're at, what that prior knowledge was supposed to look like for that skill, and also help them determine and self-determine their next steps, and also to track their progress, and also to help our teacher judgments. So it kind of helped us in many respects. And also was the way that we start to develop assessments from there on. So some of them, this one was a bit prettier than some of the others, but we started to include examples and links to like, here's where you find extra questions in the textbook, and giving a really clear idea of what these skill continuums might look like. Some are more granular and detailed, some of them are more interconnected, as you can see with this one. But for my year 9 SEAL class, I want them to know that my expectation is that they're moving from just applying a simple concept to being able to provide deductive reasoning. All right, and we don't need to be there yet, but that's where we're trying to head with this. So the importance of being able to explain your understanding is really what I'm trying to emphasize with this SEAL class, which is so hell-bent on just spitting out an answer using the most effective mental strategy, which is fantastic. I love that. But how can we then translate that into something that can be expressed as mathematical language? So back into the PLC process. So we use the developmental rubric for algebraic expressions. And we start to look at what this looked like with our timeline, the textbook, and also provide them with examples, because they see all this writing and their eyes glaze over. The second they start to see a couple of examples and focusing in particular on level 7, it becomes a little bit more clear for them. So we did a lot of data stuff. So we tried to triangulate in a way all the different data we had on those students, isolated for each class, present teachers with that. During our PLC process, we have 3 students that we focus on, lower, middle, and upper, to help to track how the thing that we're working on is applying to those students and how it affects them at different levels as well. Measuring student growth is another massive component. So we have a pre-test and a post-test. We use Education Perfect because I find it automates a lot of this process. It makes it really easy to track and export data. And it's really important for us as well to communicate this to the students, that your growth can be measured in this way, and that it's another way to encourage them in terms of how they're growing. So we put that on Compass as well as a separate learning task. We did some work with the staff in general in terms of identifying points of need, and we start to think about in terms of here's how students are achieving and here's how they're growing. So how can we map this out to 4 quadrants? So in the top left here, we had our high achievers, but they're low growth. Why are these high achievers low growth? And starting to look at a bit of a case study on some of these students. There might be a whole range of different factors, but let's track these students. Let's see that what we're applying, is it actually measuring out to affect what we want to affect.
So can I interrupt there? So what?
Yes, please.
Can I just take that one step further? What did you do with these students that were high and low growth?
Yep.
Because we've got the same scenario at the school I come from.
Yeah, absolutely. So what we did is we sat down as a whole teacher cohort during that meeting and identified who those students were. And then we used that to inform our PLC process, so that whatever we were trying to implement to like activating prior knowledge, which I'll get back to in just a sec, to see how that is affecting those students and if that is effective for those students.
Did you find out anything?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mixed responses, and that's because there's mixed reasons as to why they're low growth. Attendance is a major factor.
Right.
The attention focus regulation, if those 2 things aren't right, then forget everything else. After that is about how you engage those students. Are they interested, and are they actually engaging with what you're teaching? Yeah, it's
Thank you.
very complex and ongoing, and I don't have all the answers, but
Thank you.
that's some of the early findings on that. But thank you. So yes, big data focuses, because my role is mainly in this space. That's why I'm showing you so much of this. So we had a pre-test, post-test. We're able to create these Whitman charts and work out the zone of proximal development. And I just found it useful to present that to teachers at the beginning of a PLC meeting and say, all right, let's start with the data. Let's start with where we're at and isolate and find out what are the specific skills that were high growth in the last topic, low growth. Let's find out which skills they are low at the beginning of the next topic and see where we can go from there. So it's really making sure that every decision we make is grounded in the data and the reality of the situation. We've also used things like wall charts and things like that. Now we just use, we do this all digitally. Our school is really big on making very visual for the teachers. I think main thing is just make it accessible for teachers and make it make sure the data is real time and updating. Okay, so then another thing I just alluded to before as well is how we've adapted assessment to make them low floor, high ceiling. No point in our high ability students just maxing out every test, getting the 90 to 100% and then saying, great, job done. You're really limiting where they can go with that. So making sure that every single assessment now goes at least 1 to 2 levels above and really changing their perception. They're not aiming for a 80% anymore. You're now aiming to have growth along the continuum and to have at least that year's growth along each part of the skill continuum. And then reflecting that and showing it on Compass as well, so parents can also see this. At the beginning of each topic, we also get them to print the rubric into their book to highlight and tick where they were after the pre-test, and then to reassess that each week. By the end of the topic, they should see that growth in their books in highlighters in different colors to see them actually tracking that growth. Back to the planning phase, like terms were a problem with year 7s. They didn't know what they were, they didn't know how they combined, simplifying was a challenge, so we decided to focus on that. We decided in our planning phase to say, all right, here's the upcoming timeline. So what are the prior skills they're going to need to know, the prior knowledge? So just planning it out from the onset, and then creating these do now tasks to actually link to that, what they need for that lesson. So put together something like this. It wasn't super pretty, but it was effective in that it was able to provide 3 different levels of prior understanding they need for each lesson. And it's just starting each lesson with that and seeing how that goes. That gives the teacher feedback as well at the beginning of the lesson to say, all right, are they actually comfortable with this? Do I need to reteach a bit of it? Or can I safely move on to the next part? Otherwise, there's no point in moving on. Key actions and resources during the stage. So it was building on our previous stuff that we've done in term 1. What went well? Consistency of activating prior knowledge. This led to the increase of students recalling skills from previous lessons, which is really good. And we learned from our peers. So really important in this is actually we went to each other's classes and just for the beginning phase and observed. And then the next PLC, we discussed our observations and shared that. It engages all the teachers, makes them more invested. And we actually compared notes basically on how we actually implemented this. And it provided really good stimulus, I guess, for the next discussion. So we'll look at some of the resources. Also went to a PD at that time, Northeast Victorian Region Numeracy Workshop Conference, and saw another school that implemented something like this, a quick check within the classroom, thumbs up, thumbs down. They would present each of these examples one at a time at the top, and then the kids had to decide whether that was an example of like terms or not an example of like terms. And then you get a really quick sense of whether they actually understand what these like terms are. So it's making sure you're checking that continuously, reporting back. Once you get past that 80% threshold of student success, then you feel that confidence to move on to the next point that you're trying to make or how you're trying to build on that skill. All right. What do they show by the end of the cycle? So we're able to measure growth using our pre and post test. We're able to map out how our high, medium, and low students had progressed and where the gaps were. And then we're able to see their Victorian curriculum level when we got to the CAT, because the CAT we reported just like a 7.5, 8, 8.5, etc. And we're able to use that to discuss and see, all right, where are our students at? How many actually above the level? And is this actually reflective of what's happening? Cool. So it's made our teachers far more aware of what knowledge has to be activated prior to each lesson. I think a next step for us would be actually documenting this in our curriculum documentation and mapping it throughout the whole year, which is a bit of a process, but it's something that I think is going to be really important for a next step for us. We try these things in isolation, see if they work, and if it's great, we scale it. Next step is then looking at how they're remembering some of this knowledge from early in the year, because we have a big problem in maths, forgetting. All right, we taught you this last year, why don't you remember any of it? So that is definitely, was one of the next steps and findings for us.
Can I ask a question then?
Yes.
Do you have a process? So you're talking about the junior school still class yet. Do you guys have a process when the kids are off the map? So, you know, they've transcended 10 plus, probably happens in the middle school or the junior school. When you get those kids that are shown that they've hit the top of the map, you got a process for that?
So this has been a big topic of discussion because this is not, that skills team does not show everything. It does not show the mastery, for example, and how they're able to repeat it and the depth of understanding. We've looked at ways of addressing this and it just becomes very complex very quickly. If you try to measure it, you end up with 3D rubrics, which we didn't want to do. Like, it's already complex enough. So I think that's definitely an area where we're trying to work out at the moment. A lot of the solutions is trying to get them to show more of the reasoning, problem solving, working more on individualized programs and projects. We have SEAL class and extension class, and we have our mainstream classes too. So we have an element of streaming, but not for everyone. And there are other students in the other classes too. So yes, not sure if I have all the answers right now, but it's something we've discussed a lot over the last year or two, how that matches up with what we've been doing.
Sure.
But yeah, if there's ideas, I'm very eager to hear. All right, and the last step, I'm going to show you some very specific examples. I've got 10 minutes just under. So we've talked about activating prior knowledge, clearly stating learning outcomes. But now we're going to move on to the explanation, modeling, demonstration, and also the self-guided practice as well. So the explicit teaching is a really major component of the VTLM 2.0. And a lot of this comes down to formative assessment and feedback to monitor progress towards mastery. The wording I like a lot when reading about this is responsive teaching. The explicit teaching is not a lecture style process. It's not a one-way process. It's a two-way conversation. It's you trying to gauge from the student where they're at, what they're understanding, and also adjusting your teaching accordingly. So you teach something, you're checking what they understand, and then responding to it and creating a continuous cycle. You have these big long-term cycles, but the problem with these long-term cycles is you're actually not going to be able to readjust your teaching in time to catch them. So you need shorter-term cycles in the week, but also within the lesson. You want to make sure you're having 5, 6, up to 10, 12 of these little responsive teaching cycles in your lesson to make sure that you're actually meeting their needs. This is from that one-pages book. I think there's one downstairs there. They've got these great infographics as a good starting point. We did a workshop on hinge questions in particular. Has anyone heard of hinge questions? Yeah. Great, most of us are familiar. Presenting, we all do this in some way, but this is actually presenting in a more structured way. Here's 4 multiple choice options to this question that's specifically designed to test a misconception. And you can gauge very quickly if they're all picking B, but the answer is C, where the common misconception may be. It helps you to break it down and explore it a bit more. So we've been trying to implement more of these checks for understanding. You've got the true false there at the top left. That's the thumbs up, thumbs down. And then you've got here the 4 options, more of a hinge question style question. Now, these resources you may recognize, they're from this resource called Oak for Education, something we've been playing with a lot over this semester and actually finding a lot of value in. One of the reasons is because they've actually implemented so many of the VTLM aspects into their resources already. As you can see a few there at the top right. They've got the mini whiteboard icon. It's ready-made resources in a way. We're finding that they are quite big and they do need to be adapted. But as a starting point, I'm really enjoying, because if we had to create these from scratch, it just would not be possible at all with time, resourcing, etc. So we can see it actually relates to lots of different elements of the VTLM 2.0, from trying to focus their attention onto one particular thing, removing all other distractions, to accessing what they understand from their memory and knowledge, recall and retention, and then working their way towards mastery and application. So you do a few quick ones of these before you can actually get them applying what they understand. Then you can move on to your differentiated problems that they work on. Some other things, these are little quick slides. The first one, another one here is problem pairs. So making sure you present that information as a pair. You got the worked example on the left, then you ask them to do a very similar one there on the right. Not just pattern recognition, but reducing that cognitive load and asking them to really make sure that they structure their work in a particular way. After a while, you remove all the hints, and then you're able to quickly move them on to more of the mastery aspects of this. Another one here is backward fading. Something I originally thought was only useful for maybe the weaker kids, because they need to see a lot of this, like, work out what the pattern is, basically. I find that this type of explicit instruction does have benefit as well for our high achievers as well. Maybe even a shorter context or removing different steps, or it gets them really thinking about the process and how they're showing it. So it moves them towards that rapid removal of scaffolds so that they actually have to start thinking about and maybe even justifying each step so you can transfer to the other different contexts. Another one we've got here is error analysis. One on the left is picking like NAPLAN questions and saying, all right, most people actually picked A, but the answer is D. Can you tell me why most people picked A? Can you write for each one of these what the common misconception was? So all the ones that picked B, what mistake did they make? The ones that picked C, what mistakes did they make? On the one on the right here, I did it for a physics exam prep recently. And I said, all right, and I put this into AI and I said, create 3 sample responses for year 12s of what they would say at the year 12 level to this question. It's a 4-mark question. How do you achieve 4 marks in that question? Then I got students to reflect on each of these. Now, one of these is actually what the examiner's report actually wanted. The other 2 have misconceptions or missing information. Getting to really critically engage with that and think about, and then score themselves. Think like a teacher. Okay, nearly at the end here. Road to mastery. The last example I'll show is from the science context. This was last Wednesday. We did a science extension for year 10, post a presentation night. We got them to conduct their own investigation in groups, design it, conduct it, present it, and even talk about it, and then get questioned on it by different parents and teachers. So how do you get to this point where a year 10 student can produce this? We felt like we had to really break it down throughout the year. We had to go from the very beginning, what are the experiments we're going to do, and what skills are we going to focus on, and teach them explicitly throughout the year. What language do we want them to use? The vocab is going to be extremely important here. We need a model. What do these model answers actually look like? All right. How would I word it? How would another student word it? Linking to maths. So they've learned about proportion. They've learned about the concept of a linear graph. They've learned about intercepts. So let's link all those skills into the scientific context and not just disregard them. Using a logbook. So we had these logbooks. We gave them a template and making sure we really use the template so they practice logging their actions and thinking about the scientific process. Using assessments as a way to check and just demonstrate their skills. So the cat just before this, they had to display 2 graphs for each experiment, and one of them was even linearized. But we stepped them through how to do that. I showed them examples on how to do that. We did a little demo with Excel on the screen. So really like holding their hands, helping them through it, so that by the time they get to that final one, they've had experience of doing it. And the last one here is we gave them this booklet that really broke down what does a research question look like. Here's 12 examples of research questions. Here's the format I want. Now write a research question. And then now present the research question. Now try to research and understand it. Now tell me about your research question. So really walking through the process. Okay, so we spoke a lot. There's 2 minutes left. Our final slide here is just a little reflection for you. This is about your context, your call. So if there's anything from today that you think feels useful, or what's one small routine that you might adapt or test an upcoming lesson, where would it fit? What would success look like? And what support resource would help you? Also keep to hear from you if you have any ideas or reflections on anything I said, any gaps I have in what I presented as well, or Tony. We're very much keen to hear your thoughts too. But thank you for listening. Tony, do you have anything to say?
No, so feel free to have a chat around, and of course, if you want to talk to either one of us, just show up a hand and we'll come along and have a chat with you if you want an email from us or anything like that. Cool. Thanks everyone.
Thank you.